name is Amy Gruber, and I'm the Director of Enrollment Management at TASIS Portugal. And tonight we're introducing episode 11 of Coffee with Keith. Keith Chiquin is the headmaster at TASIS Portugal, and tonight his guest is David Hicks, who is the Vice Chairman of the TASIS Portugal Board of Directors, and also the Vice Chairman of the TASIS Foundation. And so David is a wealth of information, a very experienced and accomplished educator, and we're very much looking forward to tonight's conversation. Also very exciting, just to give a little sneak preview, we're getting uniform samples in, and we look forward to the uniform shop being open in August. But if you want a preview and are in the neighborhood, feel free to pop by the office and we can give you a look at what we've got so far in terms of the samples. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And Andrea, our producer / director of studies, please send it over to Keith.
Welcome back to Coffee with Keith. Did you miss us? Week 11. Week 11 means 11 weeks and 4 days until classes begin. So this is the penultimate Coffee with Keith webinar, which is to say we have one more next week where you'll meet our grade 3 teachers. And I know that makes many of you very sad, including Bruno, who may have to take his wife out on a real date on Thursdays, starting very soon. We hope everyone enjoyed a local and national holiday last week. I know our staff certainly did. Social distancing restrictions have been lifted. People seem to be taking full advantage. I understand I was one of the few people from the greater Lisbon area not in a traffic jam to the Algarve last weekend. I was, however, treated to lunch by one of our parents at this great little restaurant. It's a small casual space in Gincho, but I was told not to share the name of the place by my host. He wants to keep it quiet. Of course, you know, when places get too popular, then you can't get in. And so I just wanted people to know, I had a great lunch, it was delicious, but I have been sworn to secrecy, and my word is my bond, especially when the request comes from the Finnish mafia. While I was there, however, I had the pleasure of meeting two of our young students, Rafa and Lara, who had the good graces to come and introduce themselves to me, and I was very impressed with their manners and with the excitement they had for their new school. So here's a shout out to the two brave souls. During last week's Coffee with Keith, I mentioned it was likely we would have to employ our e-learning strategy at some point, and apparently this caused some distress to a few parents. My apologies, Sophie and company. But I want to be clear, we have no desire to teach remotely. We have only the desire to open this school in person in 11 weeks. I was suggesting simply that between the current virus and some future pandemic, it was likely at some point we might have to teach remotely for a week or a day or longer. But let's be clear, none of us want to teach remotely ever. And I know that none of you parents wish to continue as your children's teachers. So I just wanted to be clear about that. Shortly, you will be receiving an electronic survey regarding the choice of third language for middle schoolers. And so when you see that, we ask you to please respond. This will give us the information we need to complete our hiring and also to decide which third languages you really want. So that should go out in the next 7 days. Please watch for it. It will come from the admissions office. And as I've said before, we will survey our parents frequently, and we'll utilize your advice to help us improve the school. The TASIS Parent Association is another way, another device that we will utilize to gather data and recommendations from our parent group. In case you haven't heard of the TASIS Parent Association, this is a group of volunteers who are involved in the school community. We provide a physical space and meeting time, although many of you may decide to be here daily. The TASIS Parent Association is a really important feedback loop for the school, but also for assisting teachers with outings, helping new parents become acquainted with the area, working with our food service provider, potentially on menus, working with making suggestions for uniform options, occasional fundraising activities, providing constructive feedback regarding operations, taking the headmaster to lunch, all of those things. No job too big or small for our parent volunteers. Seriously, it's a great way to be involved and to meet other parents, which I know many of you are keen to do, especially those that are new to TASIS and new to Portugal. And our admissions office will, at some point in the near future, be asking for volunteers, but yet probably another survey to see who is interested in joining the foundational TASIS Parent Association. One of our parents, who shall remain nameless, I've named Sammy Porca many times in the past, so I won't name him again tonight, but as he said, I'm available and I work for free, which incidentally are the only two criteria for being involved in the TASIS Parent Association. All right, we're going to move on to our usual updates. First of all, during the last Coffee with Keith, which was 2 weeks ago, I talked about our classroom library and the reasons we were moving to a classroom library model in the first year. And I apologized to a young student in grade 7 named Kiara, who was very keen to have a central library. It was very important. Well, I've met some more students since then, and I've had lots of conversation with those students, with some of our faculty, and I have been convinced to reconsider the approach of classroom libraries. The students made a very strong case, and instead, a central learning commons with technology, group work areas, individual study space, and importantly, lots of books is a better approach. I agree. So that's what we will have, and I wanted you to know that I valued your input. And again, we've talked about leadership opportunities for our middle school students in particular, who will be the oldest students in their entire journey through TASIS. And it's an exceptional opportunity to make a footprint on this campus that someday you may send your own children to and say, you know what, I started that tradition at TASIS. So I wanted you to know I take your input very seriously. The next bit is some gossip, which normally I dislike, of course, we all do, unless it's really salacious. A few weeks ago, I talked about the advent of the online encyclopedia called Wikipedia and how it's crowdsourced, which is to say people make contributions from their areas of expertise and knowledge to a subject area. And people all around the world do this, and they build up an encyclopedia that's online and free of charge and is usually fairly accurate. In a curious turn of events recently, we discovered that the TASIS Portugal, and in fact all of the TASIS Wikipedia pages, were altered by someone not associated with TASIS. And they contain many errors, including in the written descriptions and the name of the schools. By the way, TASIS is an acronym. It stands for the American School in Switzerland. The American School in Switzerland, started by Mrs Fleming in 1956, was the first American boarding school in Europe. And all of the other TASIS schools are called TASIS, and then based on their location, in Puerto Rico, TASIS Dorado, in England, TASIS England, of course, in Portugal, TASIS Portugal. In any case, we are attempting to have the errors corrected on Wikipedia, which is far more difficult than we first anticipated. Wikipedia makes it very difficult for organizations to change their own web pages, because of bias, of course. Anyway, we're working on that. We'll get back to you when those errors are corrected. But to add to the intrigue, we've discovered that the author of these changes is a person who is a graduate from another American school, which happens to be just up the road from us here. Coincidence? Perhaps. In other news, as Andy demonstrated, our uniforms will arrive in July. They're stunning. We think you're really going to like them, including our young students. And they'll be available at our school store starting in August. We'll publish the times that the school store will be open. We have just renovated that space. It's got beautiful, bright lit mirrors, changing rooms, lots of space, and we'll have lots of product. So I know you're anxious to get uniforms. Some of our young students have already asked about ties and jackets. So there'll be lots of choice. And like our other TASIS schools, the uniform is intended to present students in a very smart looking fashion, not to present our students all to look identical. So as I said, at the other TASIS schools, you walk through the campuses and you see students all dressed in school uniform, but many of them look different from each other. We think that's important. The school policy around uniform will be published shortly, Suffice to say, if you purchase something in our school store, it fits the TASIS school policy for uniform. As well, the playing field adjacent to the school is about to be transformed from a bumpy dirt enclosure to a luscious grass surface. We're just finalizing the plans for that. We're thinking probably either completely grass or part grass and part artificial turf. We'll decide that in the next 7 days. So we'll get back to you on the next Coffee with Keith about that as well. Our outdoor classroom, our indoor gymnasium are under construction, and the indoor gymnasium, of course, will serve for dance, yoga, jiu-jitsu, and have a beautiful climbing wall. And I know lots of youngsters are keen to top rope and get some experience on a climbing wall. I do want to say one thing about our website. We have an architect who creates artistic impressions, 3D renderings of what we believe the space will look like. Some of those spaces will change. The surface color may be a different color by the time we pour it. Where we had artificial turf, we might have a rubberized surface. Where there are very mature trees, there may be saplings. We just want people to understand that this is an artist rendition of what the space may look like, we hope, in a couple of years. It may not look exactly like that in September, but the spaces will be there. Okay, on to some fun. If you read the Founding Families newsletter, and if you read the one this week, you will have seen Della getting a head start on robotics. You will have seen young Vigo, a man after my own heart, providing a wicked drum solo, a la John Bonham or Ringo Starr or Keith Moon. So that was outstanding. Thanks for sending those along, students and parents. We've also had more mascot suggestions. The most recent one was interesting. It was the peacocks, the TASIS peacocks, which someone in my office said was fitting, since I'm often seen preening around in the office. So I'm happy to announce that person is no longer with us. So let's move on to tonight's program and meet our honored guest. David Byrne Hicks, a true gentleman and scholar, attended Princeton University for his undergraduate study, and then on to the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. For those who are not familiar with the Rhodes Scholarship Program, it's the oldest and perhaps most prestigious international scholarship program for highly talented students to study at Oxford. David did that, and then after leaving Oxford, served as an officer in the US Navy and on the staff of the US Naval War College. From those early teaching days, David was recruited to become a headmaster in a small school in the southern US at the young age of 29. That was in 1977, which is coincidental because that is the year of my birth. David has been the headmaster of several prominent independent schools, including St. Mark's in Texas, St. Paul's in New Hampshire, and he has written extensively. His book on K-12 education, Norms and Nobility, won an American Library Association's award as Outstanding Book on Education in 1981, and has been frequently reprinted. Purchased, of course, mostly by David's family. Also published is a translation of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, entitled The Emperor's Handbook, co-written by David and his very talented brother. So Mr. Hicks also served as the academic officer at the end of his long career in schools with the Meritas family of schools from 2006 to 2015. So in short, David Hicks knows schools. David Hicks now lives and joins us from his home in rural Montana with his wife Betsy, who, by the way, is even more impressive and infinitely nicer and better looking. David, who has spent considerable time with us over the past 10 months here in Portugal, could not join us tonight in person because he, well, first of all, they're prohibited from traveling, and secondly, he runs a very unique summer camp through his church and is currently in the midst of constructing a monastery on his acreage, as well as running his organic farm. So this is not a person who sits around waiting for things to happen. David is very much a can-do person, and he's been an inspiration for all of us. He's certainly been an inspiration for me as my academic thought partner over the last many months, helping us to form and craft what we believe is the finest curriculum at what we intend to be the finest school in the country. I'll also mention that David, because you may see this young character running back and forth, David has a new pup named Atticus. He's a golden lab, and there is a prize for anyone under the age of 18 who can tell me from which novel that name derives. Atticus the dog also, by the way, is much nicer and better looking. So with all that fanfare, let's welcome David, and congratulations, by the way. I understand, David, that you enjoyed an important milestone yesterday, 39 years young. And very mature for your age. By the way, that David was born in 1948, which was also when Mahatma Gandhi was unfortunately assassinated. It was when the US Congress ratified the Marshall Plan, approving $17 billion in aid to Europe, which seems somewhat relevant today. The car company Porsche was founded. David prefers Audi, as well as the invention of the long play record, which was a 33 1/3 speed record. I think probably David listened to classical music on that when it first came out. And also, interestingly, the game of Scrabble was invented. But most importantly, a Swiss-born outdoorsman invented Velcro, which is coincidental because we're a Swiss-based school, and it's also the shoe securing mechanism of choice for children and seniors. Sounds like a great year to be born. You are on the leading edge of the baby boom. David, welcome. David, I don't know if you're muted, so I'll ask you to unmute. I've got some questions for you.
No, thank you, Keith. I don't think I am muted.
Okay.
Hear me?
I thought maybe you left after that introduction.
Okay, I don't believe I am muted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, so thank you.
Wonderful. Well, this is actually not my first coffee with Keith. Anybody who knows Keith Chequin knows that he is a nonstop coffee drinker. And so whenever I've been in Portugal, our conversations usually happen over coffee. But this is my first virtual coffee with Keith. And thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it very much. I just wanted to say that my dog is not named for a character out of an American novel, but he is named for Cicero's best friend.
Oh, well done. Okay. Now you've proved it, though, David. No one can win the prize.
Who is also, I assume, the character out of the novel must have been named after that person as well. Anyway, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to some really tough questions.
Well, and Amy here, interrupting for one moment because Keith, you'll be proud, even though you were not correct about the name of David's dog. One of our students did, in fact, know the answer, that the title of the novel was To Kill a Mockingbird. So thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, well, we're going to make sure that Jonathan gets a prize.
Well done.
Okay, so David, we've got some introductory questions, and I want to just let the audience know that we had Fernando Gonzalez, our board chair here, it's more than a month ago, and we asked him some of the same questions. But I think it's important for our audience to hear from our entire board, and since our board is very small, there's just the two of you, they'll be comparing answers, I'm sure. Now, David, you've been a headmaster at 4 schools. You've also helped to start many schools in your role as Chief Academic Officer at Meritas. What, in your opinion, makes for a great school?
Well, in a word, a great culture. I'll give you my little short Greek take. I'm a classicist, so you'll have to forgive me. But you know, in ancient Greek, there was only one word that is now translated either as culture or education. That word was paideia, because the Greeks understood that it's really the culture of a polis or of a place that really does the educating. And if you think back to your experience in school, I think you'll probably agree with me that you don't remember a lot about specifically what you learned in class, but you took away from that experience a lot of wisdom, a lot of lessons that have served you well in life. Reminds you of that book that came out a few years ago about everything important I learned in life, I learned in kindergarten. I mean, there's a lot of truth in that we as teachers with advanced degrees don't like to admit. But the reality is that it's it's the schools with the really great cultures that are the great schools. Strong cultures, wholesome cultures that encourage students to, be fair, be honest, be just, work hard, always do their best, not look for superficial rewards, but look for more interior, take their sense of worth from deeper wells than just grades or some other little reward. So I think, we can talk about curriculum, but it's the schools that have these great cultures that are the great schools. Paideia.
Thank you, David. That's how I describe what a great school would be as well for TASIS Portugal. I've often said my primary job after hiring the best people is to help build the right culture at this school. So thanks for reiterating that. It's funny that you mentioned the book, Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. I bought that book recently for one of our kindergarten teachers because we impress upon our teachers and our families that the foundational years are so important, not just academically, obviously they are for academic achievement as well, but for really having a successful experience in schools. And so thank you for that comment. Maybe you can tell us how you ended up with TASIS, because you've not been a head of school at a TASIS school, but you've been with TASIS for some years.
I think it started after you mentioned a book that I wrote a long time ago called Norms and Nobility, which won some awards and came to the attention of one of the foundation board members of TASIS, who also brought the book to the attention of Mrs Fleming, the founder of TASIS. And she liked the book and she invited me to give a commencement address at the school in Switzerland about 25 years ago. And that's how I really became acquainted with TASIS. After that, the school in England, actually Mrs Fleming, who owned all of these schools, wanted to perpetuate her schools into the future beyond her own death. She was at that time in her 80s. And so she wanted some help in figuring out how exactly to do that. And the TASIS schools hired me to help transition from a profit-making entity owned by a person to a non-profit-making foundation. And she very generously gave the considerable wealth she had developed over a lifetime. She poured it into these schools and set up the foundation. And of course, after we did that, sometime, maybe a year or two, I was invited to join the foundation. So that's how I became associated with TASIS.
Well, you mentioned two things, David, that I'm going to follow up with you on. First of all, can you tell us, and I asked Fernando this as well, because we talk a lot about Mrs. Fleming as our founder and also as a role model of courage. Can you talk a little bit about your time with Mrs. Fleming? I'm sure you have a story to tell or an anecdote or at least give us a sense of impression of how powerful a person she was.
Yeah, I don't know that I could tell you all the stories, but she was one of the most vivid, charismatic human beings you're likely to meet. Actually, the first time I met her, we had agreed to meet. I was flying over to give this commencement address, and we had agreed to meet up at Malpensa, the airport in Milano. And we were both flying in to go up to the school in Lugano. And so that's where I met her. And she cut this extraordinary figure walking through the Malpensa airport with all these Italian men running up to her and greeting her, and of course giving her, kisses on all cheeks. And it was extraordinary that all of these people knew who Signora Fleming was, and all wanted to be greeted by her and carry her bags or do whatever. And so I knew I was in the presence of a kind of celebrity right from the start. She had a lovely place in called Montagnola, not Montagnola, Capitignano in Florence, just outside of Florence. A beautiful estate, and I stayed there on a number of occasions. On one occasion, it was with my daughter, who always wanted to see Florence, and Mrs. Fleming invited me to stay at her place and with my daughter. And this is a little salacious, but you'll enjoy it, Keith. While I was there,
David, I want to remind you, I've heard this story, and we have young people with us, so just carry on, but be careful.
It's a safe story. I mean, it has a safe ending. She invited me to stay in her room, in her bedroom. She wasn't there. I face it. She was not there, but she welcomed me. She said, and this is, I was told later, that's unheard of, that anyone was invited to stay in her boudoir, her room, while visiting the estate. So I did, and my daughter and I had a wonderful time. We visited Florence. But ever after that, I was always introduced by Mrs. Fleming to whoever as the only man who had ever slept in her bed. It was a little embarrassing to all of us, but you have to know this woman. She could get away with the most outrageous things and make everybody laugh. But she was a really lovely, marvelous person. And to revert back to your earlier question about what makes a great school, she had a very visceral, instinctive sense of what makes great schools. And if I were to put it in one thing, it was the tremendous respect and love she had for everybody. You couldn't be in her presence without feeling like you were suddenly a very special person. And you could be a kindergarten child or an adult. You just felt her complete interest in you, her active listening to what you had to say, the questions she asked. She was very interested in the people around her. But at the same time, she had very high standards. One of the standing jokes was, no one ever dared walk into the presence of Mrs. Fleming wearing blue jeans. I mean, you had to be smartly dressed, and you had to be polite, and you had to use correct English, but that didn't put you off at all. It was like, it was part of her whole, it's what drew people to her and attracted people to her. But her schools and her presence made her schools full of love and joy. And that's, I don't think you'll ever find a TASIS graduate of those years who didn't feel that.
Keith, Amy, weighing in again for just one moment. We have a TASIS alum who is sending his twins to us this year, third grade, and he describes Mrs. Fleming as walking around campus like an Italian movie star, which is how he remembers her. But I am also weighing in to remind people that you may submit your questions for David to answer later. And we've already got some great ones rolling in, so thank you for that.
Okay, thanks, Amy. And I've just got a few more follow-up with David. By the way, David, you knew her quite intimately. Did you ever, and by the way, thank you for not telling the story I thought you were going to tell, but did anyone ever call her anything other than Mrs. Fleming?
Not in my presence, and I certainly never did.
Okay, now you touched on something about how the foundation board was founded, and you were part of that exercise. Can you tell us a bit about the foundation board, what their role is, and then what the TASIS Portugal's board role is as well, since you're on both of those, as is Fernando?
Well, the way the whole organization was set up was, first we set up a Swiss foundation, which is a not-for-profit foundation. No one on the board, our board chairs are all paid a stipend, because all board chairs have, it's almost a full-time job, as you're finding out from Fernando. But other than that, everyone is a volunteer. And the foundation itself, no one receives any dividends or shares or stock in this fund. It's a not-for-profit Swiss foundation. And the foundation owns the the schools. It owns the real estate, the buildings, because the foundation puts its money into, as it's doing in Portugal, into refurbishing and completely rebuilding this whole shopping center, Belora, and converting it to a TASIS school. All that money comes from the foundation. It doesn't come from any deep pockets or any investors or anything like that. Over time, but every school operates as an operating entity, like a little company. These schools, they end up paying the foundation board a franchise fee, as well as they pay rent for the facility because they don't own the facility. The foundation is giving the facility. It's like a virtuous circle, because what's very cool about this is the foundation takes that money from all the schools and invests it and holds it, and then continues investing back into the schools. So right now we're in phase 1 of the conversion of the Belora Center for TASIS Portugal. We will move immediately into phase 2. These phases of construction are going to cost millions of euros. All of that money will come from the foundation board. Eventually, TASIS Portugal will reach break even, we hope within year 2 or 3, when we have enough students. And at the point where TASIS Portugal starts to generate some profit, it will go to the foundation and it will continue to be recycled back to the schools in the form of capital improvements, other things that schools might have. So all of these schools, if you study these schools and look at them, they're incredibly beautiful schools. Lugano, England, are just gorgeous campuses. But all that investment has been made over the years by the foundation, which continues this kind of virtuous circle. So that's how the foundation works. The schools themselves all have their own operating boards, and they are in charge of everything operational in the school, including hiring and eventually firing the headmaster.
Here, here.
Do I need to repeat that? No, I guess not. Anyway, no, but they are in charge of making sure that the school has very strong leadership, and they support that leadership. All the foundation does is when the school makes when the school board makes a decision like hiring a new head, that decision has to be run by the foundation and approved by the foundation, as we were happy to do in the case of Keith and Amy. So that's how the relationship goes. Now, Fernando and I have been sent by the foundation board to be the operation board of TASIS Portugal, and I don't know about the wisdom of that decision, but anyway, this is what they decided. We wanted a very small board so we could act quickly. Fernando is here, I think, largely. Well, we both have quite a long history with TASIS, so we know what we want in terms of a TASIS school. Fernando has a tremendous background in architecture, being a Harvard architect himself, as well as having done most of the design work on all of our schools. So he's intimately involved in the construction phase of the school. My background is, as you know from Keith's introduction, is mostly in academics, program development, the kind of things that make schools, I hope, wonderful for students. So we've been put together, and that's sort of our role as the board here in Portugal. Our whole goal is, as Keith has said repeatedly, and I know Keith and Amy are totally, we're very excited about what they're doing because they have completely bought into this vision. We want this to be the greatest school in Europe, bar none. I mean, we want this, and if it's the greatest school in Europe, it will already be the greatest school in North America. I just wanted to bring a smile to their faces, but this is our goal, and we're going to get there. We're going to do this. This is very exciting for us, and TASIS is investing in this school because we feel over the last half century, we have learned a lot about education and what it's going to take to build a great school. TASIS Portugal is not going to be a clone of our other TASIS schools. It's going to take what we've learned at those other TASIS schools, the best we have there, and build on that to create something really unique and wonderful in Sintra. And frankly, our other TASIS schools hope at the end of the day to learn from what we're doing in Portugal. Some of the things we're doing in Portugal will be transplanted in our other schools in short order. So that's what Fernando and I are here for, and we're both of the same age, the same vintage. I mean, I was at Princeton at exactly the time he was at Harvard, which is very amusing. And I can tell you it's very exciting as an old guy to be still in the traces and have something wonderful like a project like this to work on. Much more fun than playing golf.
David, great answer. Thank you. A quick question. You graduated from Princeton around the same time as Fernando graduated from Harvard almost 50 years ago. Is it true that for the remainder of your life, Princetonians are jealous and envious of those that graduated from Harvard, or do you get over that after 10 or 15 years? No, I'm going to move on to the next question before you answer that. No, I did want to clarify one thing you said. You mentioned that in our second or third year, we're hoping that this school can be in a break-even position, but that does not include the 10 or 15 million euros that are being invested into the physical plant. That will take decades to pay off, correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay, you led me into my next question, and then I'm going to open it up. But David, of the hundreds of applicants that you had for the headmaster's position, why did you ultimately choose a Canadian? And would you say that Canadians are generally superior to Americans, or just in this one case? And take your time with that one if you want. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. We're moving on because I know you're part Canadian, and you still travel with a Canadian flag on your backpack. Last question, and maybe this one can be brief because I know we're running along here. Can you talk about the important role of teachers and how important a role, or how important it is to have the best teachers in a school? And you talked about this with culture, but maybe you can just, from your many years of hiring teachers and working with teachers, maybe you can comment on that for me.
Well, look, I think most people would agree that it is the teachers who define the culture of the school and define it for the students. I mean, as I sit at my desk here, I'll just show. There's a picture. I have a painting or a drawing right on the wall here in front of me all the time. I'm taking it off the wall here. This is a drawing of a man by the name of Pearson Curtis, who was my teacher in high school. And he was the most extraordinary, wonderful man, but you know, he taught us everything. And he taught me how to sail. He taught me how to bake on his invention, a reflector oven over an open fire. Probably I live in the wilds of Montana largely because of Pearson Curtis. He was the only master in my school who was not referred to as Mr. Curtis, Mr. So-and-so, Mr. So. We all called him PC. And he was the senior master, and that's who he was. He referred to us as general. Every boy was general. And he set the tone of that school. He was the lessons he taught. And I'll tell you one last story about PC, because this question, this answer could go on forever. But when you were a sixth former or a senior boy at the school, everybody had to memorize. There are a lot of things we had to do as sixth formers, but whether we had him in class or not, and by the time we were seniors, we never had him in class, we had to recite perfectly Samuel Coleridge's poem, Kubla Khan. And he would, while classes were changing in Memorial Hall, he would stop a sixth former in the hall and point at him and say, all right, it's your turn. And you'd have to stand in front of him while all the boys are passing by making faces at you. And you would have to absolutely recite Kubla Khan, letter perfect. And if you failed, he would just you wouldn't get the check mark. He'd make you do it again. I mean, think of that one little thing, how that defined the character and the culture of that school. And that was a teacher who did it. And the teachers, you know, the teachers I know, Keith, that you've tried to hire are all teachers who have sterling character, who have a lot of charisma, who love kids, and who are going to be given the freedom to define culture in your school in a really positive way. And to do that by just loving kids and showing the joy of learning in their own lives. So, yeah, I mean, that's the most important decision the headmaster makes. And the other thing, while I've got the mic here, I wanted to say, which I really highly applaud. There's a saying in education, it's probably a saying in business as well. If you really want to achieve greatness, you've got to change the people or change the people. And changing the people in the modern world, in terms of removing people, is becoming increasingly difficult. One of the exciting things about starting a new school is you're not inheriting individuals who really need to be repotted, put in another place, who are mediocre or tired or whatever. You have a chance to start right from the beginning, hire the people you want, and set the bar very high, as I know you have, as I've read the job descriptions and criteria. But the other thing is you want to change the people. The people who are in place have to constantly be changed and improved. And what you've done, which I think is really critical to schools and doesn't happen in schools, is you're putting time aside every 2 weeks to change the people, to bring in trainers, to keep them challenged and keep them growing in various areas. And the kinds of things you put into the curriculum, like Harvard's Project Zero, visible thinking, core knowledge, Singapore math, married to some kind of coding from the early ages. These are extraordinary. Schools aren't doing these things, and certainly not all together. But in order to do them, you have to have teachers who are willing to do them, and teachers who are willing to learn more and more as they go along, to become really expert at all of these things. And that's going to take your commitment as a school, giving resources, bringing people in, or bringing the experts in that will continue to train your teachers, but also creating time during the week when this can happen. And so I applaud that. That's going to build this learning culture that isn't going to just apply to students. It's going to run through the whole school. The teachers are a part of that learning culture. Okay, now I'm finished with my rant, and you can go on to other things.
That was great. Thank you, Dave. Excellent response. And of course, you're applauding not me. You're applauding me and my academic thought partner, who is you, because we together dreamt of this curriculum from experience. So thank you for all your contribution.
Everything you achieve will be due to me, I'm sure, Keith.
But since you brought it up, our teachers are exceptional. I've been in 10 schools. I would put this group of faculty up against any school I've been in. They're seasoned, but not overly seasoned. They've got energy, enthusiasm. They know what they're doing in the classroom, but they're also importantly willing to reflect on their professional practice and get better, if not every day, every other week. And so I'm really excited for them to arrive. We've been meeting with them virtually, some of them in person, obviously those that are here. And we are all so ready to start this school in the best possible way. So anyway, we're going to move on. Amy's going to curate the questions from the audience. We probably went on way too long, but I'll cut my final comments short, Amy, if that helps.
No, actually it was perfect. One of the questions submitted by Dominic, who's watching from South Africa, he had written early on, generally culture, as identified by David, comes from tradition, and tradition takes time. How can you curate culture, quote unquote, at a new institution? And what role do you see for teachers, students, and parents? After hearing David expand a bit more, he did say, I think my question's been answered, thank you. But I think the part that maybe David and Keith, you have not addressed is, what role do you see for, you've talked about teachers, but students and parents in this?
Well, one of the questions that sometimes arises, Keith was talking with me about this earlier, is in what respect are we an American school? You know, why do we call ourselves an American school? Why don't we call ourselves an international school? Because we're very international. And when I thought about that, I thought there were sort of basically two reasons. One is that, and I'm getting around to this, Amy, this question. One is that that's in our DNA. I mean, Mrs. Fleming was an American. The original impetus for TASIS was to bring American students to Europe to learn about Europe and learn things about Europe. Mrs. Fleming, as Keith pointed out, she loved Europe. She wasn't, you know, when an American goes to Europe now, he sees a continent that seems to be kind of ambivalent about its own history and its own past, and plagued with self-doubt. Not always, but there's a lot of that in Europe. It just hits you. Americans still have this kind of big love affair with Europe. You know, the great writers, the great music, the great art. For us, it all came from Europe, and we're a derivative culture. We derived our traditions, to go back to the South African question, as South Africa did. Much of it was derived from Europe. I mean, Europe was just an amazing thing, all the way from the Greeks and the Romans through the Renaissance to Italy, etc. And that is what Mrs. Fleming, she was in love with that. She wanted to promote that and keep that culture alive in her students. That's one reason we're American. That's what makes us American, our DNA. But the second thing is this: a lot of people in Europe don't understand that there's no such thing as an American school. I'm going to say that again. There is no such thing as an American school. We don't have, like the European countries have, a national curriculum, national standards, national this, national that. That was never the part of America. America, from the earliest colonial times, school education was left to local communities. The only requirement was that I think 1/16 or 1/32 of all the land of a township had to be dedicated to the school. After that, it was the people in the community, generally parents, who hired the head of the school, decided the curriculum, built the school. They were responsible for their own school. That is the American template. It makes it complicated for us when we go to Europe, because Europe, the European accreditation or licensing entities, they want to say, well, we want to see that you have an American curriculum. What's an American curriculum? It's different. It differs from state to state and even from community to community. So in the United States, what you have is a lot of different kinds of schools, locally controlled. Some of them are really excellent. Some of them are terrible, which is, of course, what you get when you have that kind of a free market, free-for-all. Well, in that sense, that is what, what I think of TASIS. That's TASIS. TASIS has taken, it is defining what a great school will look like. And it's drawing from Singapore in terms of its math, Silicon Valley in terms of its coding, if you like. The mandatory violin program, where does that come from? Core knowledge, which is basically an American-based knowledge, but it fits perfectly the European model because that's Mrs. Fleming's traditional view of education. We pull all these together, all these elements together to form our version of an American school. Will it look like the American school next door or in the next country, whatever? No, it won't. And nor should it. That wouldn't, if it did, it wouldn't be American. So anyway, back to the question about tradition. We're in Europe. I mean, we love the traditions of Europe. And I'm sure many of the traditions of the school will be European. But what's kind of one of the challenges that Keith faces and his team face, and he and I have talked about this a lot, is what are the rituals, the traditions that are going to make TASIS Portugal a really special school? I know you guys have been even inviting the kids to talk about your mascot or something, right? Well, all those little things go together to make the traditions. And you do face a huge challenge, as the gentleman from South Africa is pointing out. You have to create traditions de novo, right? From nothing. That's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, because you can pull from other successful schools, other traditions, local traditions within Portugal to make this a uniquely Portuguese, international, American school right there. And that's, but it's important that, because look, I mean, when I think back to my school, I told the story about PC, it's those rituals and traditions that I think about, are getting together in the chapel every Thursday morning and learning to sing 4-part harmony. 250 boys, 12, 13, 14-year-olds singing. It was very amusing. At commencement, we always had to sing for the parents who were visiting from all over the world. Honestly, they had never dreamed that a bunch of teenage boys could sing that loudly. And yet that was part of the tradition of the school. It was a singing school. And when we get back, when all of the alumni come back and we get together, we love to sing. We want to hear, how are they singing now? Of course, they're not singing as well now because now they're co-ed. They've got girls there, and the guys don't really sing out loudly when there are girls present. It's really disappointing to us. So, but anyway, that's just an old man talking.
David, we're only going to have time for one more question if you continue to answer over 15 minutes. But I just did want to add one thing. We often talk about the impact of teachers on students, but we seldom talk about the impact of students on teachers and on schools. And David and I have been in this business a long time. I could name 100 students who've had an impact on me as a teacher and a human being, and I know you could as well, David. So the culture of a school isn't just formed by the head of school or by a small group of leaders or even all the teachers. It's formed by a word that follows the word school so frequently, which is school community. And we're building a school community that involves and invites parents to be part of this journey with us. And so Dominic from South Africa, who actually I believe is Dominic from Canada originally, you're part of that if you want to be, and certainly your children will be. So anyway, I'll let you ask the next question, Amy.
Well, I think David has done a great job. So one of our students, rising 7th grader, who's sort of looking at this opportunity of being part of creating school culture, was interested in David's description of his school. And when you talked about boys being called general, and one was curious what the girls were called. And so I think you've now answered the question and talking more about the 250 boys singing every morning in chapel. But I know that the independent school you attended on Long Island, boarding school, was a transformational experience for you, and one that we hope our students here in Portugal will have as well as they join us and think about the next journey in their life. So we do have a couple of questions related to the board. Will TASIS Portugal have more board members in the future?
Probably.
And will the parents have an opportunity to meet the board personally?
Are you sure the parents would want that? Yes, well, as soon as the virus allows us to travel, I'm sure that Fernando will be going back later this month, I think. We will be coming to Portugal, and I'm looking forward to meeting the parents as well. And by the way, the whole parent question is a good one, because I hope everyone sees how it fits nicely into the way I define an American school. Because American schools were the creation of parents for their children, and continue to be that. It's not some nameless or sightless bureaucracy that decides what children should be learning. It's a community of parents who support the school and who support their children in the school, and it's their school. Now, in our case, we don't put parents on our board because that doesn't always lead to the best outcomes or decisions. But as Keith has pointed out repeatedly, we stay in constant communication with our parents through surveys, through getting to know them. We want an education that they're proud of for their children. So why? Mostly so that they can support their children correctly in the school. They need to be on board with what we're doing. If a parent's not aligned with us. You know, let's take a silly example, but you know, we're going to be doing probably more math because we're with Singapore math, because we're teaching number sense, coding. We're going to be doing more than most schools do. Now, a parent that says, "Oh, I don't believe that. I don't want my children doing a lot of math." That's okay, but that's not. The nice thing about schools like TASIS is a parent has a choice. And the thing that Keith is doing with his coffees, and that we're doing in terms of our, you know, the blogs that he's been doing, is we're making it really clear to prospective parents and families, this is what we do. This is who we are. This is what we're going to do with your children. So they are free to make a choice. Wow, this is exciting. This is what I want from my son or daughter. Or that's not really for me. I'm going to go to this old mediocre school over here because I don't want them working so hard. Of course, I'm just kidding. But the point is that the parents, they have a really important choice here. Their children will only receive this education once. Once those years are gone, they'll never go back to elementary school, primary school. There's no redo of education. You get it once. And so parents who are willing to invest the time to figure out what do they really want for their children, what's really happening in the school, and make that investment, it's a priceless thing. It's the best thing, it's the best gift they will ever give to their child. Even if they die and leave their children $1 billion, they will never give them a better gift than this. It's their decision. And they will be a part of this community, as you've pointed out.
Amy, at the risk of going overtime, I think if there's one more question, we could answer it.
There was, but David's done such a great job of bringing the messages in that the person just said it's been answered, like the community one. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the chance. Thank you for listening.
Well, David, I want to thank you. I want to thank, first of all, before I thank you, I want to thank Andrea, who I commonly forget to thank for such an amazing job of producing this Coffee with Keith show, and her daughter Alma, who's always a big help. And thanks to Amy for curating, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. To be honest with you, this is a waste of airspace if people aren't here to listen. So thank you, but David in particular, thanks for making the time. I know it's early in the day for you, and you've really added some nuance to many of the things we talk about at this school. And I think you give a history and perspective that's important for our parents and families to hear. We often say this is not a new school. This is a new campus for the TASIS schools, and we believe it's going to be as good or better than any of the TASIS schools, and we're fully invested in that. So it's the work of people like you, volunteers on our board, you and Fernando, who've created the backbone for this school. You put in countless hours, all of your experience, and we really appreciate it. I want to finish by saying to our audience that I personally feel very fortunate to be in this position. And while much of the world is currently plagued by inept and unconcerned governments, people are suffering from disease, starvation, plague, obviously, economic and racial discrimination. I want to acknowledge the good fortune that so many of us have. I feel so fortunate to live in the country of Portugal, to be here in such a beautiful place and safe environment, starting a new school, a school we are all fully committed to making the very best school for your children and our families, like our other TASIS schools do. And as I said, to be working with a board of experienced, committed, and intellectual educators who know exactly the kind of school that we need to create to be the best. I want to finish with the words of our founder, Mrs. Fleming, who in 1979 said, and talking to all of the TASIS schools, we must fulfill the TASIS mission of training our students to care on a global scale, to care for the vast number of fellow human beings far less fortunate if we expect to live in a world of peace. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. Thanks to our guest, David Hicks. David, please give love to Betsy. We'll see you soon, I hope. Everybody else, take care and good evening. Stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith. Good coffee.